Okay, so thank you everyone who is on YouTube streaming us. Thank you everyone for joining us. This is our second edition of our colloquia on language syntax change and acquisition, this time with Professor Giuseppe Samo. I'm going to introduce him. Sorry, who said that?
No, not yet, Professor. I'm a senior lecturer.
Oh, senior lecturer, yes, for sure. I'm going to introduce you in just a second. Alrighty. We're doing these every other Tuesday at 1 p.m. Brazilian time. This time it's going to be in English. I'm going to introduce Professor Giuseppe, senior lecturer Giuseppe Samo. Giuseppe, he is currently senior lecturer, like I said, researcher at the Beijing Language and Culture University, where he teaches courses of linguistics focusing on the role of synthetic theory at the interfaces with quantitative methods. He's also a committee member of the International Association of Cartographic Studies based in Macau. He's also co-organizer of the International Workshop of Synthetic Cartography since last year, and editor of the section on cartography on SynCart, which is a website which aims at offering analytical and biographical tools, which may help pursue research on cartography and locality. Today, he's going to give us the talk, Cartography Meets Quantitative Computational Syntax. As always, Professor, you have 30 to 35 minutes, and then we're going to have a question session, which is going to be about 10 to 15 minutes. I encourage everyone to send their questions in chat if you don't want to talk, but in the end, I'm going to have an open mic so everybody can ask Giuseppe your questions, okay? So please, you can start.
Thank you so much for the presentation, and thanks so much for the invitation. And I'm honored to be here. E-meeting, pity I cannot be there, but okay. So I start my presentation, and I will share my presentation. Okay. Can you see everything? It should be like okay. Is it clear enough? Can you read elements? Yes, perfect. So the title of this presentation is Cartography Meets Quantitative Computational Syntax. And it is a presentation in is ongoing work, a series of ongoing work. I will present the results from a publication that we published last year in collaboration with Professor Paola Merlo. And I will first discuss a little bit these two actors. Who is cartography, who is quantitative computational syntax, and see how they interact with each other, providing some interesting results. Okay, so we can go on. The roadmap, as we just said in the title, is very simple. Just an introduction on the cartography of syntax structures. I guess you are all familiar with this, I would not say program, well, we can make a program of research. And I know all the nice things that you are doing in Brazil and the nice publication going out in the recent months, like the Revista Linguistica or publication that are going to be published, for example, the book on Benjamin. So you know a lot about the cartography of syntax structures. Then I will present something related to the quantitative computational syntax, that is a kind of tool that we might use to test linguistic proposal. And finally, that would be the core of this presentation, towards an interaction. And we are going to look at the intervention effects in object relatives. That is a widely studied topic in psycholinguistics, in language acquisition, in syntactic theory. And I will show how we can integrate these two programs together. You probably are familiar with the cartography of syntactic structure. It's a program of research that aims to draw maps as precise and detailed as possible of syntactic configuration. Different ideas concerning when we have a functional projection, if there is a syntactic reason, if there is evidence from one language that allows us to postulate one specific functional projection if there is semantic reasons. It is the case of topic and focus, in which you have not only a syntactic displacement, but also a different interpretation, leading to what we can actually call the syntacticization of the scope discourse semantics. In other way, we might come up with a theory that is able to explain that movement, elements move in the structure for a reason, and this is the so-called criterial movement. We will not go into detail. I'm more than happy to discuss these things, for example, in the research quest, in the question and answer period. But this is more or less the idea. It's like cartography is a kind of research program aiming to detect the maps of the syntactic architecture. And you can see a nice tree trying to collect a kind of canon of syntactic configurations. Why cartography is nice? Why cartography is important? Because the cartographic enterprise has this strong heuristic capacity. Comparative analysis since Pollock, and then with the work of Guglielmo Cinque and the work of Luigi Rizzi, intralinguistically speaking, you can make fine-grained analysis of the syntax of one language and try to map this functional projection. There was a boost, we might say, of cartographic production during the end of the 1990s, in the beginning of the 2000s, with many African languages analyzed, different varieties, like especially Italo-Romance varieties, and in the recent years, a huge amount of work also on East Asian languages. Also, we in Beijing are doing, work a lot with the cartographic tools. And if you are interested in a bibliographical tool, you can find a website that is the website of the project, the ERC project SynCart, hosted by the University of Geneva and partially by the University of Siena, which gives you a bibliographical tool and an analytical tool to look for papers working in cartography. This is some screenshot of the website. You have a kind of repository of titles concerning papers discussing different languages. You have an atlas in which you click in different subregions, and you can look at what paper was written on which specific language, and also a section about the different functional projections. Naturally, this is not going to be an exhaustive work. It will take time, but the idea is to let you know about this project that and this repository, because it could be a useful tool for students, for example, master students, to look for material to read for their MA thesis, for example. But what 20 years of cartography did? They provided us a database of structures. We have a lot of material, not only working on the syntax of declarative clause as a typological works, but we know and we have syntactic accounts on different strategies about passives, cleft, dislocations, reordering reverse adverbials, as the nice work by Achilles that is in the chat, work on spaghetti configuration and V2 orders. So we are able, with cartographic tools, to try to understand which structure are a little bit more complicated than others. And we have the tools in terms of movement, in terms of principle like locality. So this almost 25 years of cartography might be translated, these results might be translated in terms of annotation schemata in order to exploit large-scale linguistic resources, such as, for example, syntactically annotated corpora. There is a huge amount of resources that we, as a theoretical linguist, we don't use too much. Because we are probably unfamiliar with certain annotation schemata, it's quite complicated to translate what we have in mind with what we are going to look for in a specific annotated corpus. So the idea of this quite, let's say, translation enterprise is to take what the results from cartography has given to us to look forward and try to see whether we are in the right direction. There is I would say, a program that is the one of the quantitative computational syntax that is in the same direction. Quantitative computational syntax is a tool, we might say, rather than a theory, but quantitative computational syntax uses large-scale resources and simple computational models in order to answer quantitative linguistic questions. So the idea for us is that we might translate the results coming from cartography into elements that we can quantify, and then we can try to look for in large-scale resources like corpora, because sometimes it's quite impossible, especially, and you probably can confirm, especially when you are in different corners of the world, it's quite complicated to find, for example, native speakers of extremely large resources, languages. So a very important thing in quantitative computational syntax is the role of frequency. We are going to investigate corpora. So it means that we don't have negative evidence. We cannot have an ungrammatical sentence. So we need to rely on the role of frequency. And the role of frequency is that differential in counts are expression of underlying grammatical properties. In other words, we make the assumption that whenever we look at specific syntactic constructions, the more it appears in a corpus, the easier is the structure. On the other way around, the less it appears in a corpus, the more complicated in the structure, and having numbers, having elements, it's not naturally a new idea, but having numbers to quantify these elements, we might be able to quantify, for example, linguistic proposal concerning intervention effects, concerning numbers of movement, type of movement, and so on. And this is the attempt of one paper. That is the paper that I wanted to present to you. It's already published. And is a paper called Intervention Effects in Object Relatives in English and in Italian, so a cross-linguistic study. Looking, for example, at one specific syntactic construction that is believed to be complicated, object relative, and try to quantify with the role of frequency, and not only the role of frequency, as we are going to see in a couple of slides, if linguistic proposals, for example, relativizing minimality, is in the right direction. I would like to thank Professor Paolo Merlo, since the slides in the presentation partially derive from the one of the presentation we give at the Quasi, that gave rise to the publication that I'm showing to you. Relative clauses, you are probably relatively familiar with the relative clauses. Not all relative clauses are equally acceptable. In a test like show me the tiger that the lion is washing, this sentence, an object relative, is considered to be much more costly than a subject relative like 1b. Show me the tiger that is watching the lion. Because in 1a, you have an object crossing a subject, whereas in b, you have no intervention effects, no elements intervening between the generation site of the subject and the landing site of the subject. Object relatives are harder than subject relatives in various respects. They could be ungrammatical in children, in a specific population of children, like very young children, as the papers by Friedman and collaborators showed. They could be more difficult to parse in adult grammar, since the work by Frauenfelder, and also investigated and ungrammatical or slower to parse also in different types of language pathology. Well, the idea is that we are going to test the notion of intervention, that is the relatively famous notion of relativized minimality, in which we have in object relatives an object crossing a subject. So, core to the explanation of these facts, there is a huge amount of work in linguistics, in language acquisition, analyzing the notion of intervener. So the intervener is an element that is similar to the two elements that are in a long distance relation, base generation locus and landing site of the object movement, and structurally intervenes between the two, blocking the relation. Intervention, the notion of intervention is that the head of the relative clause and the intervener share some computationally relevant features. The idea is that an intervener is an element that intervenes, as the name suggests, between the base generation locus and the landing site of an element that has moved, and there is intervention if the intervener and, for example, the head of the relative clause in object relative share some computationally relevant features. Just one notion, but you are probably familiar with, hierarchical and not linear. So a sentence like two is ungrammatical. When do you wonder who won? But a sentence in which the element sharing features like the like the who with respect to when is embedded inside the DP, this does not trigger the same intervention effects. So who is an intervener for when, because they share WH features. This is more or less the notion of relativized minimality. A subject moves, for example, in a position in the left periphery. I will not go into the detail concerning the position targeted by relative clauses, but the idea is that the position of relative clauses is higher than the subject. So the subject has no intervener, so it can freely move. Children comprehend and produce subject relatives. Subject relatives are easier to parse for adults, whereas objects that have to move to a relative clause position cross the subjects and create ungrammaticality in the case of children, slower time, marginality, and so on in the case of adult grammars. And this notion of relativized minimality is expressed in terms of features. So if we consider this element here to be features like type, like agreement features like singular, plural, People investigated also semantic features like animacy and so on. Our role is to investigate whether these features, which features create the most intervention effects. Different degrees of intervention. It is extracted from a recent paper by Martin and collaborators, in which identity and it's ungrammatical in both children and adults, and the relation of inclusion, intersection, and disjunction. The first one is only ungrammatical in children, the others are grammatical in adults, but with the slowing parsing time. So we expect that the slowing parsing time are less frequency in corpora. This is more or less the big question. So here comes quantitative computational syntax. So we need to look for quantitative aspects of long-distance dependency according to a theory of intervention. We make the comparison of theoretically expected and observed counts of features in grammatical structure, which indicate which set of feature plays a role in the syntax of object-relative clause. Here there is two notions. We have the observed count, and this is the pure frequency that we are going to extract from corpora. And then we have the notion of expected counts. As we mentioned earlier, it's not a new concept, but we try to expand this concept in terms of locality effects. Naturally, this work can also be read with different accounts. The quantitative computational syntax is not only something for cartography, but it's something that could be used in different accounts to test different linguistic proposals. So I'm just trying to translate cartographic results in order to be tested quantitatively. How to do so? So we are not going to test subjects. We are not to test native speakers. We are going to ask this question to syntactically annotated corpora. We adopt a nice resource that is the Universal Dependencies Tree Bank. It's a series of more than 90 languages, more than 123 banks, which are syntactically annotated. So there are 90 languages, different size naturally, annotated with the same exactly annotation scheme. That is more or less similar to the notion of dependencies. We have subject, objects, different elements, different dependencies in terms of the DP, and so on. Plus, you also have annotation in terms of part of speech, you have annotation in terms of morphosyntactic features. So this resource is something that we might use to ask our linguistic question. Disclaimer, important. One important aspect in verifying intervention-based explanation of the difficulty of object relatives is determining which features trigger the intervention. That effect is that we are looking in corpora. So in corpora, we are going to find object relatives, which are grammatical structures in adult grammar. So what we are going to expect, this is what we are going to see at the end of this presentation, is that the type of intervention is qualitatively different from the other of the type of long-distance deconstruction created by ungrammatical sentences. So keep in mind that we are going to discuss about counts on grammatical structures. So we should expect at a certain layer of explanation that the two intervention effects are not the very same. So let's see which type of relevant features we looked at. We look at the notion of time. We looked at there is a typo. We look at, for example, if an element is a lexical element or a pronoun or a maximal projection. We are going to see that in the specific in the next slide. We looked at agreement features. We looked at, for example, a number. For example, if a subject or an object is a singular or plural. We wanted to also test person, but the person is extremely clear factor. We will see in ongoing work that the person definitely play a role in disentangling the relations. And then we wanted to test the animacy to see whether there is an ameliorative effect in terms of mismatch in animacy. So we just, for example, coded different object relatives according to the different features. These are naturally occurring examples from the corpora we investigated that will be presented later in the material section. And for example, an element like the debate is a maximal projection, is singular and is inanimate. Whereas the subject is a head, is plural, and is inanimate. So in this sense, we have a total mismatch in terms of features. In the second example, those lovely little chocolates that we get, we have an object that is a maximal projection, is plural, and is inanimate. And we have a subject that is a head, so mismatch in type, but match in number and mismatch in animacy. And also, we can also find cases of full mismatch cases as il terreno che l'acqua copre, the ground that the water covers, that is XP singular inanimate, XP singular inanimate. So full matching configuration. So we can, once we know the method to code these elements and how to expect certain results, we can do the research questions. We can create our research questions. So since we want to investigate type, number, and animacy, we want to know whether these features play a role in intervention effects. And if the features play a role in intervention effects, are these effects stronger in a given language? That's why we wanted to analyze two languages like English and Italian, and having different morphosyntactic realization of certain features, and plus using universal dependencies, because this tool is a tool that is annotated in the very same way. So in other words, we can, with the same query, find different languages. Then we need the definition of feature matching, that a feature match that in the name of a functional matching between a relative head and an intervener is true if for a given feature f we have the same value. And the idea is that if a feature is a strong intervener, we should expect to have greater, let's say, in accessibility, but in terms like in mere quantitative terms, surface less often in a corpus in a match configuration. And these are the hypotheses that are done taking into account what we just said. So both in Italian and English, if the feature type number of enemies triggers intervention effects, we should expect match configuration to be less frequent than expected, and no match configuration more frequent than expected. And further hypothesis, if the feature number triggers intervention effects, the effect should be larger in Italian than in English. Now, here we will confirm this hypothesis, rejecting the null hypothesis that these two hypotheses create. The materials are the tree banks of UD version 2.0. Now we have much more languages. This was done almost 1 year ago, this paper. And we used a tool, and we looked at query providing us all the object to the left of the verb. Then a manual analysis of the authors manually typed this the type of element. Naturally, now there are more and more tools that we can use to automatically retrieve all the relevant information and the relevant features. So 5 free banks, 3 for English, and 2 for Italian, and 1 parallel tree bank for both languages to see whether there is dimensional variation between the two. Not too much, so we just keep these elements the different tree banks for every language, and we confirm in some way a prediction and a result that was studied in Roland and collaborators, in which different corpora show very large differences in frequency distribution. There are corpora showing that object relatives are 86% of the left-it elements, and languages and tree banks in which the object relatives are only a subpart of the fronted elements. Then we did the encoding, and the encoding is exactly the same as we just showed some slides ago. So for every element, we looked at the relative head and the intervener, their features, and then we created a further mapping concerning the matching configuration. So the 2 Boolean operators, 0 means mismatch, 1 means match. We did this for English. Some examples you can look at it in the paper concerning the different combination of match configuration. The same for Italian, and we can go and look for how to quantify the expectation. And here just come the simple computational model. So we looked at the features in SVO context in order to see whether there is an increasing or a decreasing of matching configuration in object relatives. So the expected counts are on the basis of the probability of features to be the head of the to be a subject, like the subject has the probability of having a certain features, times the probability of the same features to be displayed in the object, times the number of object relatives. So in some way we have we create a kind of probability of matching configuration if there is no syntactic structure behind, as if the same percentage that we find in declarative clauses SVO we should expect the same type of numbers in object relatives. So we took a sample of 100 sentences in the different languages, and we check the number of subject or an object to be a maximal projection, to be a pronoun, to be animate, to be inanimate, and we see that there are some tendencies. For example, subject in English tends to be more animate than inanimate. But this is some results that we definitely know. And the object in English tends to be more pronominal in the corpus that we investigated than pronominal, and to be more maximal projection than pronominal. And this is important because we need to know what happens in SVO, because if we just look at the observed counts and we see that there is a lot of animate subjects, animate object, we might think that animacy plays a bigger role. No, we need to set up an expectancy, and this expectancy is given by the the probability of a subject or an object to have a certain features. We only did another mechanism that we did is that we did an adjusted counts because not every element could be ahead of a relative. So creating this expectation, we can look then at the results. And we observe that the match condition that in SVO sentences are expected if they keep the very same feature configuration as the expected counts, we see that there is a decreasing. So it means that we observe less matching conditions for certain features than expected. And this is the case of the match configuration with two maximal projection and also in an inanimate context. And we can see that there is a decrease, and we can see that there is an increase in mismatch conditions. So the mismatch condition, we observe more mismatch conditions in object relatives than the one that we expected from the counts. An interesting result comes also from the fact that also semantic features like animacy play a role, and we can see that there is a marginal mismatch conditions also in Italian with singular and plural. So as if there is a kind of preference for the mismatch concerning a morphosyntactic feature that is morphosyntactically realized in Italian a little bit more than in English, but it's not too much. And this is going the line of what we were discussing. So we can see that there is a preference for mismatch configuration, but we are in grammatical structures. So what probably creates difficulties in children is a little bit more overcome in adult grammars. So the hypothesis is confirmed in most cases for both English and Italian, and there is an increase of observed non-match configuration, possibly compatible with an intervention effect. So one can think also about the final grain distinction. We can discuss probably on another similarity working concerning grammatically versus ungrammatically. We need to go into this type of final grain distinction. We should investigate a little bit more about if the ungrammaticality is just in sense of narrow similarity, and then we have a broad similarity in which there is ameliorating effects with a semantic point of view. These types of similarity, however, predict different results in intervention effects if we want to check similarity with the vectorial semantic spaces. And there is a paper by Merlo and Francesco Ackerman that investigate this type of question, showing that at the moment, this notion of broad similarity needs something to be, we need to detect a little bit better. Like we need to detect and go into depth. This is a kind of new way of analyzing intervention effects. So the conclusion is that the differential encounts are the expression of underlying grammatical properties, and this is what has been predicted by the quantitative computational syntax. Cartographic results then might provide a ForMA tool for quantitative analysis. We saw that the fact that you have an object relative totally changed the expectation with concerning the frequency of specific feature configurations. Ongoing work on different types of structures. At the EGG, there will be that has been delayed. There will be a paper on N-merged systems, testing with quantitative methods. At the Linguistic Society of Europe, there will be a talk about cleft. So ongoing work is doing a lot to try to detect this type of intervention effects. So, obrigado, thank you so much, and hope that everything was clear. If you have a question.
Thank you, Professor Giuseppe. So I'm going to open the mic.
I'm sorry.
No, don't worry. I think we still have around 15 minutes until 2 o'clock here in Brazil. So we have that time. If anyone would like to ask questions, I encourage you to either send them to me in Portuguese or in English. I can read them out. Or if you feel brave enough, the mic is open to anyone who wants to ask questions.
Can you hear me? Yeah.
Yes, I can hear you. Yes.
Thank you very much for your nice talk. Very interesting, not only for cartography, but for linguistic theory as well. Well, I was wondering about the reach of your paper to cartography. Let me try to be more clear.
Yes.
Thinking on some very important cartographic tools like transitivity tests, the one we find very commonly in some cartographic papers, we do not find combinations which are normally found in grammaticality judgment tasks. For instance, those expedients of the cinque hierarchy, give an adverb from one semantic class co-occurring with another adverb in just one order, namely A preceding B, but not B preceding A. So how the work can be extended? How can the work be extended to those domains, for instance, transitivity tests, which we normally don't find in corpora?
Actually, thank you so much for the question. This is really interesting because I'm working on that, because the idea is that corpora are not annotated by cartographists, and tendentially you want to have an annotation to be the most automatic as possible. So what we need to do is try to translate our syntactic trees in queries for syntactic dependencies. So what one can do, for example, with transitivity test would be, for example, checking the occurrences of an adverb plus a syntactic dependency in terms of precedence, in terms of adjacency. So I think there we can do a lot of things about that. The fact is that it's a corpus study, so it's an observational study. So you don't have all the evidence you require. So this is what could be the tricky part, but in some way, we are just looking for testing the cartographic results with the automatic tool. So this is the main idea. It would be amazing if we might able to have a corpus of negative evidence. Then it will be much easier to merge the two things, but it's quite complicated. But yes, there are many ways to detect things. The only thing is to translate the syntactic tree, the cartographic tree, into a dependency relation, and a little bit play with the tools and try to figure it out.
Very good. Thank you, Professor Achilles. We still have a few more minutes if anyone wants to ask a second question. So it's much harder when it's online, right? I'm sorry, go on. Did you want to say something, Giuseppe?
No, I'm just waiting for questions.
Okay.
I skipped a little bit the last part with the numbers, but you can check into the publication. It's
Great.
online, it's open, so it's,
send me a link and then I will share with people, and also on the YouTube comments.
I think it's the abstract. When I quoted the paper, I also put the link to download from the ontology of the ACL.
Great. So people who got the email already have the link. and I will share that with the YouTube comments. So if nobody else has questions, I will give it another second just to make sure. Very well. Well, Professor Giuseppe, thank you very much for the presentation. I keep calling you Professor.
Yeah, no, it's fine.
Shall I ask him another question?
Yeah, sure, Achilles, if you...
Yes.
Okay. Thank you again. Well, we are very familiar with Keynes' one feature, one head principle, which can be a cartographic guideline to define a functional projection. So my question is, how can your work help us to better define the one feature, one head principle in terms of structural dependencies? Thank you.
Okay, thank you so much. It's an interesting question. So the fact is that these tools are not written by syntheticians, and they annotate only the things they see. They do not annotate everything they don't see because they want to be theory free in some way. So for example, in Italian, you will not see in every sentence the dependency subject, because in Italian is a non-subject language. There is the opportunity that the subject is not realized. Now you need to try to detect your you need to try to detect your query in a way that you overcome these difficulties. The very same problem is, for example, you don't know whether an object, for example, in German scrambling, you don't know whether the complement has been scrambled or not, because you can detect with respect to another element, but for example, you cannot get any prosody, you cannot get any further features. So the problem is that working with the corpora data, you have missing data. We are like children trying to detect the language when we are kids with missing primary linguistic data. So it's the same. We try to detect elements with missing elements. We try to detect generalization with missing elements. And this is like the most tricky part. It's like the trickiest part is really to try to expand our rich tree with the dependencies that are not rich at all. But it is the best tool that we have right now, because I don't think that we might have 1 million tokens annotated for cartographic trees in the near future. I mean, I will try not to do it. It's quite time consuming. But this is the idea, that if we're able to, well, this paper is inspired by many works in distributional semantics and informal semantics that try to, in computational semantics, that tries to translate dependencies into compositional semantics trees, like ready and collaborators and so on. So in some ways, more or less the same thing. It's like translating dependency into cartographic trees, but the fact is that there is no mutual exchange. We will miss information from both sides.
All right, thank you. I think we might have a question here coming from YouTube. I'm just going to confirm exactly what the person is asking here. I think Josie on YouTube wants to know where these ongoing researchers are happening mainly, and I suppose it's in your research group, right? But maybe she's asking if there's like you and other people are working on this, so if it's mainly you, and yeah, at what institution?
Okay,
Yes,
yes, well, we are doing that, for example, now at the Beijing Language and Culture University. There are 2 presentations and some, well, I cannot say because I'm streamed on YouTube concerning papers, so I will lose the anonymity, so I will not say that. And yes, there will be one presentation that will be done at the EGG, at the Incontro di Grammatica Generativa in Siena, and one presentation at the Linguistic Society of Europe in Bucharest that will be streamed online. But I hope that soon there might be some further publication online from me and from the group. But a good idea, so for example, if somebody is interested in quantitative computational syntax and not the interaction with cartography, is work by Paola Merlo, a professor at the University of Geneva, that made a lot of interesting works in quantifying hypotheses. One that I suggest is the testing. There is one publication on Glossa with Sara Oyuada that is on testing the universal 20, the theory of Guglielmo Cinque, testing with vectorial representation. So different types of tools and different types of research, but it's quite young. So hope to have in the next future to have more and more things to do and things to show in hope in a real life conference and not on YouTube or in. I wanted to be in Brazil. That's fine.
We wanted to have you here for sure.
Well, we could have gone to lunch right now.
Exactly. That's no, that's unfortunate. Usually we do this after lunch, so everybody is well filled up, for the presentation and before any classes start.
Okay.
Very
Thank
well.
you so much. If everything is fine, thank you so much again. Obrigado for everything, and happy to see you in Beijing as soon as possible, and hope to be in Brazil as soon as possible.
Obrigado, Giuseppe. Thank you very much. Thank you for accepting. And
have a nice day.
You too.
Bye-bye.
Bye-bye.
Thank you, Giuseppe. Thank you, Rafael. Tchau, gente.
Bye-bye.
Bye-bye.